Hello, everybody. Once again, thanks for joining me for the Hispanic Heritage Lecture. It'll be sort of like a lecture, but not in a traditional sense. We're doing this online. But once again, you took some time to just stop and learn a little bit. And so I appreciate you joining me for that. We're going to be talking about a little known fact in history. I don't think too many people knew what we were about to discuss. I know I didn't really know until doing research and reading and things like that. And so the title of this lecture is The Would-Be African Diaspora Triumvirate. It's looking at three countries in particular. We'll get to that in a quick second. But first, what I want to do is sort of give some feedback or give a overview, if you will, on why we're looking at something about the African diaspora with respect to Hispanic Heritage Month. So generally, when we think of the Hispanic or Latinx community, we often think of the indigenous background, we think of the European background, but we don't always give as much thought to the African presence in that history, in that heritage. If you see behind me is a map on this presentation. It's a map of the globe, and in black is Africa. But as you see around it, all that green represents African people that are around the world. That is the diaspora. All of those people, whether they were people that migrated, a lot of times, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, they were shipped there to be enslaved peoples. But African people have a presence all over the world, and that is the diaspora. And so when we think of Hispanic, Latinx, Latino history, we have to consider the African origins, because it's a huge part of Hispanic heritage. It's a huge part of the story. And the real part of the story that is often forgotten is the history of resistance, right? When we think of African peoples around the world, particularly here in the Western Hemisphere, we're thinking enslavement. But that's not the whole story. And so what today's lecture is really about is to really explain how that heritage looks a little bit different than the narrative that you heard growing up, that I've heard growing up. It's a little bit different than what we're used to. And again, it highlights the history of resistance, the history of fighting back against white supremacy, against colonialism, against imperialism. And so we're going to talk about that today. We want to bring some of that stuff to light today. First, I want to go over a couple of definitions. We talked about the African diaspora. We saw that in that map, the idea of the worldwide collection of African peoples throughout the world, specifically the Western Hemisphere. There's colonialism, the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control of another country, occupying it with settlers, exploiting it economically, even hijacking some cultural stuff, right? So that's colonialism. Imperialism is a little bit different. A policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force. So colonialism is when one country goes into another country, takes it over, sends settlers, does its thing. Imperialism is we're not going to come into your country, but we're going to extend our might, our economic might, our political might, our military might, to influence you to do exactly what it is that we would want you to do to benefit us, of course. So that's the difference between those terms. A triumvirate is a collection of three men, or in this case, what we'll talk about, groups holding power. And lastly, the idea of a Spanish Creole. They are Europeans, Spanish from Spain in particular, born in the Americas. So in this case, when we talk about Spanish Creoles, we're talking about European people, white people who have Spanish heritage, born in the Americas. And that would be whether it is Mexico, whether it is Peru, Colombia, any Spanish territory, colonial territory at the time. When we say Creole, we mean a Spanish person born in the Americas, where it's a little bit different than the term French Creole. So with that being said, we're going to go to Mexico, and we're going to start with this gentleman right here. His name is Vicente Guerrero, and he was a general, one of the leading generals. He became the lead general in the revolutionary struggle for independence from Spain in Mexico. He was called the consummator of independence. He was an Afro mestizo. So that term mestizo is he was partially European, Spanish heritage, and then partially indigenous. But he was also Afro. So, of course, he has African heritage in particular. But his skin color, this picture behind me might not tell the whole tale, but he was dark skinned, a very dark skinned person. He was called the Black El Negro. The Spanish actually mocked him, called him the Black Guerrero because of his dark skin. But nevertheless, this guy was a problem. He led the fight for independence from the Spanish. And not only that, but he played a role in Mexican politics. And eventually he became president of Mexico, the first president of African descent. There was only two presidents at the time. He was the second, but he was the first to be of African descent. That's who this guy was. Now, his platform, he championed the causes of the racially oppressed and the economically oppressed, particularly the African and the indigenous poor. And it was a vision that was not shared by everybody in Mexico, particularly the Creole folks did not share that similar vision. But Guerrero was led by these politics, and that led him to abolishing enslavement throughout all of Mexico. There were territories where there was enslavement and territories where there weren't. But this man came in office and said, nope, no more enslavement throughout the entirety of Mexico. So roughly April, maybe 4 or 5 months after his ascending as president, he abolishes enslavement. He's called the Mexican Abraham Lincoln, actually called the Lincoln before Lincoln, right? He does this in 1829. And the other thing that he did that was interesting is that he removed all racial categories from birth, marriage, and death certificates. Now, why would you do that? Why is that important? Well, because the Spanish, when they were in charge, they had race on top of all of these certificates. And the reason why is because depending on your racial category, there were certain jobs and taxes that were attached to it. And as a means of resistance, you would have folks in various parts of Mexico, particularly your Catholic priest. They would remove the racial recognition so that way they could protect the indigenous and African folks there. And so this even happened in Guerrero's hometown. So him outlawing race or removing race from all of these certificates ensured that no one would be taxed unfairly. No one would be given a job unfairly because of the color of their skin. He wanted to make sure that all people in Mexico were treated fairly, that were treated equally. That was his legacy. That's who this guy was. And it pissed off a lot of people, particularly those Creole folks. Now, going back to enslavement, him abolishing enslavement, it had huge ramifications, particularly in Texas. The history is, of course, Texas was a territory of Mexico. It was a part of Mexico, and Americans came to Mexico. And the reason why is because, the Mexican people, the government wanted to inhabit the area. They wanted people to come settle in the area. And so they allowed for Americans to come. Now, of course, the states next to Texas, the one in particular being Louisiana, there's Arkansas is there too, but you have Louisiana, I'm sorry. And Louisiana was a slave state. So when folks were coming over from the United States into Mexico, into Texas, they were bringing their enslaved captives with them. So we have an issue, right? Because Guerrero outlawed enslavement, but because he was afraid of all of the Americans coming in, of course, them being white, he did not want for them to take over Texas. And so there was a law created on behalf of the settled Americans where there was an agreement. We would not outlaw enslavement if you had an enslaved person when you came here. And so that was supposed to be the compromise. Now, fast forward, after Guerrero, the other leaders of Mexico enforced the law. And that was one of, if not the chief reason why you have the Texas Revolution, right? So that's just a foreshadowing of what is to come. But we're not focusing on that today. That's just for you to know that when folks talk about Texas and the Texas Revolution, it had to do with the fact that Mexico outlawed, abolished enslavement under Guerrero, and eventually enforced the law in Texas. And the Texans, the Americans who outnumbered the Mexicans in Texas, were against it. And so that's where the revolution comes from. But back to Guerrero. He outlaws enslavement, right? He abolishes it in Mexico, but he has other plans. There's another country in the Western Hemisphere that has rebelled successfully against its colonial captor or colonial power, and that's the Haitians. That's Haiti. In 1804, Haiti became an independent Black nation in the Western Hemisphere. Scared everybody to death because the enslaved peoples led that revolution. And they outlawed enslavement there too. And the reason why it scared everybody to death, you have to understand, Haiti was the most profitable territory in all of the New World. It was called a diamond, a crown jewel, and the French were in control. It was so profitable. And now you have enslaved peoples taking it over, right? And so that scared a lot of people. Of course, we're talking about colonial powers, we're talking about white people. It scared those folks because, I mean, you didn't want your enslaved people catching the fever of liberation. But it happened in Mexico where Guerrero led a liberation movement, and not only for, Mexicans of power, but for the poor, for the marginalized, for the oppressed. And he abolished enslavement. And so he looked to the other country in the Western Hemisphere that was free for the same reason. He looked to Haiti and he sent a special envoy. He sent someone to go over there and negotiate a peace treaty with their president. Now, the reason why, he was looking to put together a power base between himself, Mexico, the Haitians, but also he had eyes on Cuba. Cuba for a long time was looking to liberate themselves from the Spanish as well. And Cuba had a very high population of enslaved African peoples. And so the idea was, if the three countries could come together, that would make for a strong, united union in the midst of colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. That was a big deal. The significance of this alliance is huge. It's so huge. They were about to establish a three-group power triumvirate, right? Mexico faced pressures from the United States and Spain. This is why they wanted to do it. The Spanish could possibly reinvade. You got the Americans coming into Texas. And so they faced that kind of pressure, right? In addition to whatever internal pressures they had, right? So you have that. The Haitians were cool with the idea because, of course, they had just recently annexed the Dominican Republic. They were actually raising troops to go into invade Cuba. This is absent what was happening in Mexico. They were actually trying to send troops into Cuba at the time. So they were cool with it. And to have another ally in Mexico would be major for them. And then again, Cuba had a secret society made up of Mexican people, right, to plan a revolution. So it was expected that the Mexicans and the Haitians would arrive to support the enslaved revolts that were happening already. There were a couple happening in the 1830s and early 1830. And they were going to go there and they were going to support those revolts and then set off a mass revolution in Cuba. And that scared the mess out of all in these colonialists, all of these colonial powers, they were just like, we can't have it. We can't have it. The British said we can't have it. The Americans, although they didn't necessarily start their imperialism yet, they still understood the power of enslaved peoples freeing themselves from their colonial powers. They didn't want that spirit coming to the South. They could not have it. The Spanish had other territories. We can't have it. The colonial powers could not see this happen. 3 nations, 3 independent African nations in the Western Hemisphere that shed itself from both the Spanish and the French. It just couldn't happen. So the rails began to fall off, right? It all began to fall. There was the threat of the Spanish invasion. Like I said, that Guerrero was already afraid of that, but the threat was even more real. And then it came to a head where Guerrero's vice president turned on him. Just straight up turned on him, rebelled against Guerrero, and there was this whole big thing. And then finally, Guerrero on Christmas Day, 1829, he resigned from office. And Congress declared this man mentally and morally unfit. Mentally and morally unfit to do this. They were like, no, he can't be president. We're going to make Anastasio Bustamante president, the vice president. He's now president, right? He's a 3rd president. But here's something that he doesn't do. He doesn't stop what Guerrero started with trying to negotiate this treaty with the Haitians. He doesn't stop it. But, the rails are coming off. And here's the chief reason why. The British, again, like I said, colonial power, still had territory out there in the Western Hemisphere. They absolutely feared a alliance between the Mexicans, the Haitians, and the Cubans. And so they sent a foreign diplomat to Mexico where they had discussions, and they said, listen, we cannot have you do this. And so Mexico, rightly concerned about their fate as a nation, they used the idea of having this alliance with Haiti and Cuba to get concessions. And so with the Spanish trying to possibly invade, that was something that the Mexicans were worried about. And so their idea was, okay, well, let's see how far we can go with this. How can we use what we're going to do to our advantage? Because, hey, we can still do this. And so the British said, all right, listen. How about we talk to the Spanish on your behalf? We'll talk to them on your behalf. We'll make sure that they don't come into your country. And as long as you don't do this, we'll make sure that they don't come in. Now, the British did that. They said, we'll take care of that. But it wasn't just the British that played a role. It was also the Americans. The United States played a role as well. They helped out. They said, oh, no, Britain, we'll step in and help you, too. The more to support this, the better the chances we'll have of not having this sort of alliance happen. Secretary of State, he was then Secretary of State and the 8th President of the United States, Martin Van Buren, he spoke to the Mexican minister and he said, we will encourage Spain not to invade in exchange for Mexico to make sure that, underlined, we will never try to foment rebellion among the people of color in the Spanish Antilles, to which the United States could never be indifferent, seeing as they have so many in that class in the southern states. He was very coded, if you will. But basically, he said what I just said. He told the Mexicans, listen, we'll make sure that the Spanish never invades. We'll make sure that they recognize you as a nation. We will recognize you as a nation. All the colonial power will recognize you as a nation. So long as you do not rile up these Africans to fight against their colonial powers. Don't go to Cuba. Don't have an alliance with the Haitians. So long as you do that, so long as you don't allow yourself to get engaged with these anarchists, I'm sure they would call it. But as long as you don't engage with African peoples fighting back against Europe for their freedom to be liberated and to take the power of the economics of their community as well as the politics. As long as you don't do that, you're good. Because what the United States and Great Britain feared was that a rebellion in Cuba would spill to rebellions other places. Of course, for the United States, that means a rebellion in the South. And believe you me, if you have a Mexico and a Cuba and a Haiti, all free, led by African peoples, the Spanish peoples and French peoples of African descent, because of course the culture mixed with the African culture, if you will. If you have those people threatening to go to the United States and help liberate Africans in the United States, that is a problem. I can't reiterate that enough, because now you are trampling over the colonialism. You're trampling over the capitalism. You're trampling over the white supremacy. It knocks down the whole myth, right? And it knocks all the money down. Now the money's going to cease. And so enslavement is so critical. It's so important to the colonial model. It's so important to the economic model of the United States, as well as to Spain and other countries. They couldn't have this. And so as for Guerrero, what happens? We know he resigned on Christmas of 1829. And, you know, even though he resigned, he still fought. It didn't mean that he was going to stop fighting. It just meant I'll resign, get myself together, and I'll fight this. We're going to fight this. And he fought in the South. He went back home and he had his folks and they fought trying to get back control. But unfortunately, in a scheme, he and his men were captured. They were sent over to the Mexican authorities. And on Valentine's Day in 1831, he was executed. And the reason why he was executed, because there were other quote unquote dictators, right, who were put in exile. Normally that's what would happen, but they executed Guerrero. Why? Well, because Guerrero was of African heritage and he looked African, he looked black, he had black skin, right? The opposition to Guerrero came from the wealthy. It came from the landowners, the powerful, the Creoles, right? These are the Spanish peoples that were born in the Americas. And Guerrero's execution was a warning sign to anybody who looked like him, that was indigenous or African, and they wanted to take control and run for president. It was a warning. Don't you ever do anything like this, because we will kill you just like we killed him. And so that's the history. But again, this idea that you bring peoples together, this man Guerrero understood we have to get away from the Spanish and we will create our own country. And not only will we create our own country, but we will lock in arms with our African brothers other places, in France, in Haiti, having defeated the French, in Cuba. We will help them defeat the Spanish like we did. And we will form a group. We will form a triumvirate of power that we can help liberate other nations throughout the diaspora. See, he saw diaspora. Don't get me wrong. Mexico has a rich culture. They are very much a national culture. It is Mexico. We are Mexican. That is very much a part of Mexican culture. But this dude saw even beyond that. He saw diaspora. And if we can liberate other nations like ourselves and get them out of enslavement, we can actually be a force and begin to take hold of our nations, our politics, our economics. And of course, that was all thwarted. Understandably so, from the Mexican standpoint, they just wanted to be a nation. And once Guerrero got out the picture, it was like, well, let's do things a little bit different. And so history didn't end up the way that Guerrero was intending for it to end. But the key is that, again, when we talk about the heritage of Latin America, when we talk about Hispanic heritage, Latinx heritage, there is a weaving, a braid of three different things going on. You have the European, you have the indigenous, you have the African. And that braiding plays itself out in the culture, in Latinx culture, and Hispanic culture, that plays out in different ways. And depending on what country you're from or what country you visit, the culture can look very different. Some a little bit more African, some a little bit more indigenous, some a little bit more European. But what we must remember and never forget is that the legacy of Hispanic heritage, it isn't simply in the cultivating of people by colonial powers, right? It's not just thinking about what the Europeans did, but it's also the idea of what that culture bore out in terms of independence and in terms of liberation. And it wasn't just to liberate themselves from their colonial power to, live their own destiny. But a lot of that, although true, was tied to this idea of setting the captives free, removing enslavement from their future. Maybe it was a part of the DNA of the colonial power, but it didn't have to be a part of the DNA of the new nation. And so a lot of nations embodied that sense of duty to their fellow man, members of the diaspora, not just here, but all over the diaspora. And that's the legacy. That's the legacy of Hispanic heritage. As much as it is, when we think about it, we think about the food, of course, we think about the music, which is awesome. That food and that culture, that music, that's tied into Africans as well. But when we talk about the real thing, we're talking about this history of resistance, this history of understanding placement within the diaspora, this anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, anti-enslavement narrative and mindset that really guided a number of nations in Latin America to independence. And this idea of, again, fighting against enslavement, fighting against this taking over, this colonialism, that's a strong portion of the heritage. And so hopefully we communicated that to you today. So never, ever, ever take anybody's word for anything these days, right? Because you want to know where are you getting your information from. So I have right here a list of sources. These are a couple of books. I think one journal article, but you should try and get your hands on it. At the very least, the books, the journal articles might be a little bit tough. You got to have a subscription. You may have to get to a college or something like that. South to Freedom, Runaway Slaves to Mexico and the Road to the Civil War. That's a great book to get your hands on. Black in Latin America. That's another great book to get your hands on. Try and find those if you can. Again, let me put this one disclaimer out here. Carter G. Woodson, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black history, gave a wonderful resource in the Journal of Negro History. And there's so much there. If you can get yourself a subscription to JSTOR, I don't think it's too expensive. It might be $100 a year or something to that effect. If you can get yourself a subscription to JSTOR, do yourself a favor and do that. If you want to learn more about history, if you want to learn more about the truth that folks are trying to prevent you from learning, to prevent your children from learning, get you a JSTOR subscription and look up the Journal of Negro History. It's some good stuff in there. It's some really good stuff that talks about the history of the United States, the history of Latin America, the history of the Western Hemisphere, and history of Africa and portions of Europe as well. So that's just some really good stuff. I suggest that you try to do that. At the very least, get your hands on those books that I mentioned. Some good stuff there. So again, thank you for joining me for this presentation. It was a pleasure to be able to speak to you all today. And again, I hope that you gained some great information from this. The idea for this came from my work. I'm actually working and teaching a number of lessons to high school students through this sort of process. And it just came to me, why not do a bigger lecture? Those talks are generally 5 to 10 minutes. This was a little bit longer. So I just wanted to try and do something so that way everybody got some more information, got to learn a few more things. So again, thank you so much for joining me. And again, I hope that you learned something new. And I hope that you take this information and teach it to somebody else. Tell it to someone else. Keep the cycle going, the learning going.